Joining me now from Nehalem, Oregon, is the co-creator of the Occupy Wall Street movement and author of The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. Micah White, nice to see you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So obviously the protest on Saturday, I was in D.C. It was pretty nuts. There were so many people there. It seemed a little bit all over the place in terms of messaging, but there were a lot of people turning out. And I guess people are wondering now, how do you take any of that and turn it into something more substantive? Do you think it is the beginning of a movement?
Look, it could be. It absolutely could be. But the more I listen to the organizers, the more I get a little bit afraid, because I think that there's this kind of, right now we're in this glow. We had 4 million people in America. It's amazing. But the reality is that we know that street protests alone do not bring the people greater political power. And so the movement if it wants to create a movement, it needs to orient specifically towards how to gain political power. And the only way to do that, in my eyes, is to launch a movement that can win elections. And that would mean a kind of beautiful movement forward that would be, I think, very difficult to pull off, but it's the only real way to do it. So I think we're in a dangerous moment where it's easy to be complacent, but I also think we're in a hopeful moment where, yeah, there's a lot of militancy on the streets. We can do this. We can launch a movement that wins elections.
It's interesting that we're even using the word movement because, of course, that's what the new president calls what he did, right? He says it was a movement. He got people together over a period of time. So are you talking about some sort of new political party? Would that be the direction they would go? Would it be a takeover of another party? Does it have to be the traditional, inside the traditional political system that exists?
Right, and that's the big strategic question.
Yeah.
So we have in Europe the development of social movements like Podemos in Spain, the Pirate Party in Iceland, and the Five Star Movement in Italy, all three of which have won elections in a very short amount of time, and they're social movements, not traditional political parties. So that would be one way of doing it, would be to launch a women's party, a women's movement that's actually a political party. And then there's also this question of, well, didn't Donald Trump basically take over the Republican Party, and couldn't we do that? I think that that's possible. I think that what he did is kind of inspiring in a certain way, but I would put my cards on. Let's get out there and build a women-led social movement that can win elections, not just in America, but in multiple countries in order to carry out a kind of revolutionary agenda. I think that that's really the future.
Okay, but the lessons, you're the guy to talk to about this because you co-founded the Occupy movement and you call it a constructive failure. So there are lessons from that. What are the lessons then that the people that were walking in the street should take from that movement about why it fizzled out?
Okay, the number one lesson that people have to understand is that behind every act of protest is basically a theory of social change, okay? And the theory of social change that underpins contemporary large-scale marches is that somehow if you get enough people in the streets, largely nonviolent, unified behind some general message, then the people in power will have to listen to them, that the crowds will manifest some sort of magical, collective, sovereign, general will, and it sounds ridiculous when you spell it out, but that's really what we're doing. And the thing to understand is that is not true. There is no constitutional requirement that Donald Trump listen to protests once they exceed 4 million people in the streets, which is what we did. And we know this now because of the 2003 anti-war march on February 15th, which was also global, which also failed. So the theory of social change underpinning large-scale marches is broken, and it's not true. The only theory of social change right now that I think is valid is that we can use social protests to win elections, or we can use social protests to win wars. That's the only two options. And so I think that winning elections is the only viable way forward. That's the real lesson of Occupy and all the protests that have come up before to this point.
But are there not examples in history of marches that did work, that did lead to direct results? If you think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s march onto Washington, are those not examples of times where, yes, that made a big difference?
Look, I think it's important to realize that I'm not saying that these tactics have never worked in human history. Right. What I'm saying is that effective tactics that once worked become ineffective in our present day. Okay, if I were to say, let's build an army that's going to fight a war like World War I, let's build trenches, that'll beat America. I mean, that's ridiculous because we now have airplanes. So, if you think about it, it may have been true that in 1963, when, Martin Luther King marched and all this kind of stuff, the U.S. government was not prepared to deal with this tactic. They are prepared to deal with it now. When Occupy Wall Street started, they were not prepared to deal with the encampment tactic. They are prepared to deal with it now. So it's crucial to understand that we're in a back and forth, it's like a form of warfare. And our adversaries learn very quickly, and so do we as well. And that's the crucial thing, is to not get stuck on, well, it worked in the past, it must be effective today. I mean,
Sure.
precisely because it worked in the past is why it's not effective today.
So what would you say to the people then that marched all over the world? You know, there were people here in Canada that marched too. And again, the message may be a little disjointed. That was the thing that struck me. There were people, marching for women's rights or gay rights or water rights, or, it was anything and everything under the sun. What would you say to those activists, those people that want to turn what Saturday was for them into something, that's real, that will work?
Yeah. Well, we're living through a time of the largest protests and most frequent protests in human history. So we have to not get confused by the fact that we are going to continue to see large-scale protests. The question now is how to make them effective.
Yeah.
And again, it gets back to this question of how do we actually take power and govern? How do we build social movements that take power and govern? I'm going to give you a concrete example. We had 4 million people in the streets, some people are saying. 4 million people. Okay, it only requires 1 million signatures to get a third party on the ballot in every single state in America. The Green Party was not able to do that in the last election. But we now see it could be done. We had 4 times the number. If only half the people who went to the march had signed a petition saying we want a women's party on the 2018 ballot, it would be there. So we need to reconceive of what these protests are and what the point of them is. I think that if we had a large-scale march and the point of it had been, we're going to gather a lot of signatures in one single day, and that's how we're going to take power, I'd be dancing in the streets right now. I'd be dancing. But when the strategy becomes, we're going to have a large-scale march, and then what comes the day after is they're now advocating sending postcards.
Yeah.
It's garbage. That's garbage. And so the people who are part of this march need to say, it's up to us. It's up to us. It's up to us to launch a political party. We can do this. It only took Donald Trump 18 months to capture the presidency. Think about that. We are less than, we still have more than 18 months till the next main midterm election in America. We have time to do this.
Okay, well, it's fascinating to watch, and I wonder how many people are thinking the way you are, and whether there is time to do it, in fact. Anyway, thanks for making time for Canada. I appreciate it, Micah. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.